Okay, well, we'll get started. Welcome to this Wednesday webinar. We're looking today at green recovery. I guess in the kind of post-COVID environment, there's been a lot talked about in terms of economic recovery. And I think the green economy has certainly been raised by many people as part of that. And for those of you who aren't aware, there's actually a deadline on a consultation piece of work for the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee that's due on the 7th of August, so just in a couple of days' time, looking at kind of what should green recovery mean. So we thought it was a timely thing to do. We're always keen at Social Enterprise Scotland to hear views from our members and across the sector that feed into our consultations. And of course, we also often look at what other organisations are also saying in their responses. We know we can't be experts on everything, so sometimes we're looking to our kind of colleagues and friends who perhaps know particular fields in more detail than us. So this is great for us in terms of being able to hear what other people's responses are, and also to hear from members in terms of feeding in. And I can see also through the attendee list, we've certainly got people who have that kind of reuse and circular economy background. So that's great, and certainly one of the things I think Duncan will talk about that we're touching on in our response a little bit. So the session today, we're going to start off with David Kelly, who's Policy Manager at SCDI, Scottish Council for Development and Industry. For those unfamiliar with acronyms, I think we tend to slip into them too much. And then once David's presented the responses and the kind of thoughts that SCDI are looking at, we're going to look at what CRNS, Community Resource Network Scotland, just to go through the next acronym with you, and Michael's going to take us through that, and then we're going to finish off a little bit with hearing from Duncan. So without further ado, David, I'm going to turn off my video and audio, you'll be pleased to hear, and hand over to you. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Naomi. Good morning, everyone. Big thank you, first of all, to Naomi, Duncan and the rest of the team at Social Enterprise Scotland for having me along to speak today. Really appreciate the opportunity. As Naomi says, I'm David Kelly, Policy Manager at SCDI. So just to kind of set the scene, I think I'm going to try to cover three things in my remarks today to start off with. First of all, just a bit of brief background about who we are and what we do at SCDI. As Naomi says, there's a big alphabet soup in Scotland to wade through to maybe figure that out if you're not familiar with us already. Secondly, I'm going to kind of ask, what does green recovery actually mean? How do we define that? And then lastly, talk through our recent green recovery report and its recommendations, concluding with some of the key takeaways and big issues learned from that piece of work. So first of all, SCDI, we are a membership organisation and perhaps one of the most diverse in Scotland because we represent businesses and organisations, big and small, from all sectors and all geographies of the Scottish economy. We've been around a long time. We've seen a lot of crises in that period since being created in 1931 as a kind of response to the Great Depression and the crises of that era. So we bring together and represent large private sector employers, SMEs and sole traders, public sector organisations and institutions, colleges and universities, trade unions, local authorities, and of course social enterprises as well. So it'd be great to have anyone on the call on board if you're not already. My role at SCDI is twofold, really, helping support SCDI as a place and a platform for people to connect with others, to collaborate with others and learn, exchange ideas. And secondly, thought leadership and developing policy ideas to support social and economic prosperity for Scotland. I also represent SCDI on a couple of external groups that we're involved with, such as the Climate Emergency Response Group. So because of that diversity of membership, we are impartial and non-political and try to work with governments of all stripes, both at Scottish and at UK level. So what does green recovery actually mean? I suppose since lockdown, we'll have all encountered lots of different terms being bandied about around the new normal, build back better, green recovery, from lots of different sources, sometimes with kind of competing or divergent interests and agendas. And so for lots of different organisations, they're defined in lots of different ways. For us, we're interested in how do we move beyond that kind of rhetoric and use of buzzwords into practical action that delivers real progress. What are the real challenges and what are the real solutions? So for us, in discussion with our members, we see green recovery as at the same time quite straightforward, also quite complex. So it means tackling two fundamental, I suppose, almost existential problems at the same time. First of all, the economic crisis that clearly has been created by the global public health emergency of COVID-19, as well as the global climate emergency, which clearly hasn't gone away just because we're focused in the short term on another big problem. So that means having to answer two big questions, I suppose, simultaneously. First of all, how do we recover from the COVID crisis, building back better to increase resilience, to improve equality, to improve prosperity? And that means being resilient to and recognising future likely shocks and disruption, whether that is environmental or in terms of public health or economic. I think we've clearly seen that there are some parts of our society and economy that are more resilient to disruption than others. So how can we build on that and strengthen for the whole country? And the second question would be, how do we reduce emissions and protect the environment as we do so? So we aren't just building or going back to a quite extractive, damaging kind of growth that's bad for the environment, bad for people and planet, and that helps us progress towards net zero by 2045. So that's the Scottish Government's key target to get Scotland there, and that's very much a stretch target. That's going to be really challenging for Scotland. So we need to look at ways to figure out how we can create growth that is much more inclusive and sustainable than perhaps the type of growth that we've had in the past. So we're looking at both, I suppose. What does green recovery encapsulate? It encapsulates the challenges of both public health emergencies and climate emergencies. We have to do both. I think we can do both. It's going to be a big challenge, but also we actually identify a lot of big opportunities, particularly for Scotland and our own competitive advantage in this. We have an opportunity to rethink and reset the way that we design economic policy and the way that we run businesses and social enterprises. And we have, I think, one thing that's important not to forget, we have big public support, I think, for this kind of agenda. According to a YouGov poll near the start of lockdown, only 9% of people in the UK wanted to simply turn the clock back to the way things were before the pandemic. So there's a real appetite and thirst for change. So we kind of were engaging with a lot of these ideas, having a think about that, and wanted to set out a bit of a plan for how we might get there. And we did this with our Clean Growth Leadership Group, which brings me to our report that we published back in June, Building Scotland's Green Recovery, which you can download from our website. And the report is the product of quite extensive engagement with our members and partners and others. So we had an evidence build that involved online surveys, virtual focus groups, and other meetings and calls with business leaders, thought leaders and experts to try and inform what we were doing. We also looked at data and forecasts that were emerging from domestic sources in Scotland and the UK. So the likes of the Office for National Statistics, Fraser Valander Institute, etc. But also to try and take a look at the experiences of other countries who were perhaps ahead of the curve in terms of infection rates. So particularly in East Asia countries who experienced the start of the pandemic before we did, and are perhaps moving into recovery quicker than ourselves, but also ahead of the curve in terms of green innovation and policy success in that regard. And we also wanted to kind of learn from the last big crisis of 2008 and 2009 to see what are the lessons that we can learn from that. For the past decade, really, before the beginning of the pandemic, we had a very slow, weak and quite uneven recovery from the Great Recession that many people referred to as a lost decade of growth for Scotland. So productivity growth was very weak, GDP growth was very weak, and inequalities were increasing during that time. So how can we build stronger foundations of growth and recovering from this crisis? So from all of those sources, gathering all of those views and evidence, we realised that there were a number of big kind of challenges that any green recovery plan of ours would have to address. The first and perhaps most important was the sense of a looming unemployment crisis. So despite the weakness of that recovery from the Great Recession of more than a decade ago, during that period, unemployment has been really low, largely under 4%, at record lows in Scotland. Although there's been question marks over the quality of a lot of that work and the low paid or insecure nature of a lot of it, we did have really high rates of employment, and that was a good thing. The problem is we're now faced with a situation, as we'll all have seen, of lots of big employers and big brands planning large-scale redundancies, and recent data showing that over half of Scottish employers expect to cut their workforce when the furlough scheme begins to end, and obviously that support's already kind of tapering off. So we know we need to create new jobs to prevent a return to the kind of mass unemployment we maybe saw in the 80s and 70s. Also, inequalities have been laid bare by the crisis in terms of inequality of access to green spaces or public services, the long-term scarring effects, particularly on young people, key workers, disproportionately likely to be ethnic minorities and therefore disproportionately likely to be exposed to the risk of catching the virus. I suppose the SQA results controversy of the last couple of days kind of underlines the point that the way that we change, the way that we do things differently during this period and going forward, we'll have to take account of the fact that we don't want to exacerbate existing inequalities or entrench them in the way that we do things. And quickly, a couple of other things. Consumer demand, obviously, and confidence is really low, has gone through the floor, and that's a big problem for key sectors of the Scottish economy like retail and tourism, which are big employers. And that leads to a lot of businesses really struggling with cash flow and even survival. So we need to figure out a plan to rescue the businesses that we need to rescue. So during this process for building our report, we're developing ideas with 4 fundamental principles in mind. So first of all, impact. We wanted, recognising the scale of those challenges, we wanted ideas that were going to maximise the impact on jobs, on productivity, on well-being, and that we're going to deliver results in the short term. So we're talking months rather than years. Resilience. So again, looking to future crises and disruption, how can we increase the resilience of our society and economy to future changes? We know that climate change will continue to disrupt supply chains, it will disrupt communities, the way we live, but also there'll be big disruption from automation and technological change coming down the tracks as well. Thirdly, fairness. So again, looking at targeting support at risk communities and trying to reduce inequality. And fourthly, ambition. So trying to think of ideas that build on Scotland's strengths to develop real competitive advantage in the global economy. So what do we want Scotland to be known for internationally? And how can we use that to compete with other countries? Because we know that we will inevitably have to do that. So some of the key recommendations that came from our report that we developed to try and tackle those problems. First of all, we talked about the need for a green stimulus package for the government to take a lead on investment-led recovery, recognising that the economy is now falling into a downward cycle and that we need investment to reverse that. So we identified a lot of options for programmes of investment nationally that really we could categorise as either shovel ready or near enough, things that we could get going quite quickly, where it's possible with the right design to get workers to transfer into those sectors or to help SMEs, social enterprises and others in a potential supply chain to help deliver those programmes. So those are things like buildings retrofit and energy efficiency. So that has the positive effect of creating warmer homes for people, targeting that particularly at the worst housing stock in our most deprived neighbourhoods, reducing levels of fuel poverty, but also reducing emissions. Domestic buildings are one of the largest sectors of carbon emissions for Scotland that we need to tackle to get to net zero. And those kind of programmes are particularly labour intensive, so investing heavily in those kinds of programmes would potentially create significant numbers of jobs. Also looking at new technologies like heat pumps, investing in low and zero carbon transport infrastructure, so EV charging points, low and zero carbon public transport as well, trying to invest to help bus companies, for example, to transition to hydrogen or to electric vehicles. Investing in active travel routes, so not only the temporary kind of interventions we've seen so far from local authorities in terms of closing off certain roads to help pedestrians and cyclists move around, but doing much more comprehensive stuff to create better ways to move around towns and cities in particular. Also nature-based solutions like native tree planting and peatland restoration. These are programmes that the Scottish Government has been investing in over the last several years, but it's important that we scale these up to meet the moment. And finally, digital connectivity. So the way that we are able to do this now and to work from home, particularly in rural areas, is really based on solid broadband connections. So we need to invest heavily in stuff like 5G to make sure that we are resilient in the future and that people can work from wherever they need to work from in Scotland to keep productivity going. And in all of this, there is a big opportunity for the public sector to shift its supply chains and its procurement to more locally based SMEs, social enterprises and others. So another recommendation we have is to try and reform the rules of public procurement, which tend to favour not only larger companies, but tend to be focused on a lowest cost model. We think that the government and other public agencies should look at the community wealth building approach that's been pioneered in places like Preston, but is also being explored in North Ayrshire now, to basically favour the local economy in your procuring publicly and really harness the power of the public pound to deliver local growth. Some other recommendations around the labour market and skills. We think that there's a need for particular intervention to establish some kind of transition pathway for workforces who will be affected by large-scale redundancies that are expected, that I mentioned earlier. So as a particular example, the energy sector, we know that thousands of people will probably be made redundant from the energy sector over the coming months. So how do we make sure we don't lose their expertise and support them into other green jobs, because their expertise and experience will be critical in getting to net zero. Similarly, a job guarantee for young people something that could be delivered by a lot of local SMEs and social enterprises with government funding. So really pleased to see that in the government's response today to the Benny Higgins review of economic recovery. That was a key idea which made its way into that report as well. And finally, a green reskilling and upskilling fund. So this is something we've explored in depth for a number of months in other pieces of work as well. And really it's to try and make sure that individuals have the access they need to short, bite-size reskilling and upskilling opportunities, particularly through distance learning, online learning, whether that's from domestic sources here or sources of education globally, to develop green skills that organisations and employers need to decarbonise. So things like carbon literacy, carbon management, skills and waste in the circular economy. If we think about, even just as a kind of basic example, we have rafts of people working as, say, car mechanics who will have to reskill and upskill from working with internal combustion engines to working with electric vehicles. So how do we make sure that people aren't left behind in that transition, in that process, and that they have an opportunity to get those new green jobs of the future. I suppose quickly just to say that other key messages that came through from our engagement with our members was the need to collaborate rather than compete to deliver net zero. So particularly thinking about cities and different sectors, we want to pool the resources of Scotland to achieve that together, rather than something that had kind of been happening previously where different cities or different companies or different sectors try to set targets, basically competing with each other to see who can be more green. We don't want unintended consequences of that process kind of spilling over to stop us getting to net zero. We all have to be pushing in the same direction. And also, I think, interestingly, a big recognition came through in our engagement with members of the fact that we don't want bailouts that are unconditional. So a lot of talk about different sectors and businesses that are in trouble, who might seek public money to support them surviving at some point. And quite a recognition there from our businesses and organisations to say that there should be strong net zero conditionality attached to these bailouts to help those businesses and organisations transition. As an interesting example, the Austrian government has agreed a bailout for Austrian airlines, which is worth hundreds of millions of euros, but part of that bailout is transitioning investment from domestic air travel to domestic train travel. So basically there will be, Austrian Airlines will no longer be serving the domestic air travel market. And that's basically part of the deal that they've made with the government. So that provides an example of what we can achieve in this country, transitioning investment from really high carbon sources of transport or of industry, whatever it may be, into low and zero carbon alternatives. So just as a kind of to wrap up, as a few takeaways to summarise what I've said. First of all, we need to respond to the climate crisis with the same urgency as this public health crisis. Secondly, we need to recognise the scale of the problem facing us and to meet the moment. And thirdly, to do that, we believe we need the government to lead and invest now and invest big in green infrastructure, in green technological innovation, and in green skills and jobs. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think what that shows is actually how broad the whole green recovery agenda is. It covers so many topics, and I think it was interesting as well that you talked a little bit about procurement, because I know certainly within, whether you're an SME or a social enterprise, procurement has been quite difficult and prohibitive, and I suspect we'll come back to that in the Q&A. I'm going to pass over to Michael, because I'm conscious that we obviously leave time for Q&A at the end, but I want to make sure we have enough time for Michael and just a couple of thoughts from Duncan. So over to you now, Michael.
Great, thank you. And similarly, thank you to Naomi and Duncan for the invite to share today. I actually think it's a poignant time to be asking these questions for several reasons, and social enterprises, and it's great that Social Enterprise Scotland are hosting this, are really well placed to feed into green recovery. Green speaks of environmental objectives and environmental mission, and recovery obviously touches on jobs. It's more than that, but it does focus on getting jobs back if we've lost them. And I think charities and businesses potentially would have a narrower focus than the broader term of social enterprise. Obviously businesses create jobs, and obviously charities are mission driven and also have jobs, but I think social enterprise in its very definition is typically trading, creating jobs, but mission and purpose driven, and that could be the environment, it could be social. So I think the green recovery is really apt for social enterprises to be at the forefront of that. Let me just quickly introduce CRNS. We're another 4-letter acronym, a membership body in Scotland, and we focus on members, quite a narrow focus on charities and social enterprises who are doing reuse, repair, recycling in Scotland. And it was great to see a few of our members have dialed in as participants today. Welcome. We have a two-way role: represent the sector and support the sector. And clearly that has had a real focus in the last few months in relation to COVID-19. How do we support our members, many of whom have seen a catastrophic drop in income as the high street has been shut down, at the same time as they've had increased demand on the work they do if they're doing food banks or starter packs, or in terms of serving the vulnerable in their communities. And we're supported by Zero Waste Scotland, who are the Scottish Government's sort of circular economy arm here in Scotland. Scotland is, I'm going to take a fairly high level approach here and rather than go into too much detail. I hope that I want to provoke people to think about green recovery. Scotland is at a crossroads. We're at the meeting point of two crises. For the last few years, more and more organisations, more and more people have been acknowledging that there is a global climate emergency. And the likes of David Attenborough and Greta Thunberg have all been pioneering on that. That's an environmental crisis, obviously, and it's global, but has local implications too. And then the last few months have obviously been overtaken by COVID-19 as a public health crisis with massive economic and social implications, not experienced in our lifetime, probably not experienced since SCDI was set up in the 30s, was the last time we had something of this magnitude in terms of rocking changes. And then there's the small impact of Brexit as well. I saw Lynn's question in the Q&A. I mean, that would have been, that was the biggest thing we faced a few years ago, and it's still not totally happened yet. So the possibility of a no-deal Brexit at the end of this year, which might have further economic and social impacts, and indeed environmental ones, because at the moment our environmental legislation has largely been legislated at the European level. So how do we as a country, how does Scotland, how does the UK, and globally, how do we balance the environmental, the social, and the economic when we start thinking about recovery? And what do we mean by the word recovery anyway? An economist might define an economic recovery after a recession as getting back to where we were before, the same level of jobs, the same level of GDP. But a doctor, when you've been sick, might think a bit more holistically than that, getting back to a place of health, a place of well-being. And the provocative question that difference highlights is, how healthy were we before? How healthy was Scotland's economy? How healthy was our society? And how healthy is our environment locally and globally? And obviously a lot to be desired, and the climate emergency is bringing that to attention. So green recovery, putting the concept of green recovery together, it has many aspects to it: energy, transport. Duncan's spoken about some of those, but I want to talk about resource management. I want to talk about the stuff that we buy, that we use, that we live with, and ultimately at the end of its life, when we finish with, the stuff that we throw away. Zero Waste Scotland has estimated that 74% of Scotland's carbon footprint is embedded in the stuff that we buy. Making it, which may be in Scotland or it may be abroad, getting it to us, transport, maybe flying it or shipping it or trucking it, using it for the period of its life, and then disposing it at the end, maybe landfill or something better than that. 74% of Scotland's carbon footprint is involved in that. And the model that we would present for this, and is largely accepted now by many groups, government and down, is the move to a linear, from a linear economy to a circular economy. Let me just share a slide here. Hope you can all see that. So a linear economy, shown here at the top, is where we take stuff out of the ground, virgin materials typically, extract them. We make them into a product with all the energy that goes into doing that. We use them for their useful life, and then we lose them, throw them away into landfill typically. So the start and the end of that is taking stuff out the ground and putting it back into the ground. And that is not sustainable because there's only so many resources. SEPA have estimated that Scotland, if the whole world lived like that, we would need 3 planet Earths. And when I last looked, we only had the one. So that's the problem. We can't just keep going like that forever. How's the circular economy different? Well, that's shown on the right-hand side here. And this is where we keep items in high value use for as long as possible. If you have a laptop, it's obviously made the first time, but you use it. If you're finished with it, you go give it to someone else who reuses it. If it's broken, you repair it. And as a last resort, if it can really not be a laptop anymore, probably because Microsoft won't support the operating system on it, then you're going to break it down in its constituent parts and recycle it. And so you're not taking stuff out the ground. Typically, you're building that new product with recycled material from leftover products. And I started by saying we're at a crossroads, and at every good crossroads, you have a traffic light. I'm going to just hang my thoughts on the metaphor of red, amber, green as traffic lights to think about where we're at and where we're going on this journey of a green recovery. Red, a lot of climate-related action has actually stopped because of COVID-19, and that's a bit depressing, to be honest. Deposit return scheme has been postponed till 2021. The circular economy bill has been put back to the next parliament. COP26, which was due to be happening this November, has been put back to next year. So there's a real risk of a loss of momentum in tackling the climate crisis. Climate isn't the only crisis in town with COVID-19, and I understand that. I understand all the focus that has rightly gone into COVID-19. No one denies that. But there is a risk we lose momentum and we stop prioritizing some of the things we were doing, to be honest, weren't doing fast enough, and we do them slower. There's a risk that in the economic recovery agenda, we lose sight of the green agenda, and green recovery will be an attempt to keep those agendas connected and progressing at a healthy speed. And what about amber? Well, obviously when you pause, when you stop, there's an opportunity to rethink. At a junction, you can rethink about what your destination is, can't you? And maybe choose a new destination. So what are our priorities? Where are we going? And how can Scotland use some of the lessons from this crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, in the next one? There's a simple, in terms of in the climate emergency, there's a simple model that we would, again, share that's widely accepted as what we should be doing, which is to follow the waste hierarchy. That's the triangle on the left. You've got your highest priorities at the top. That's what you want to be doing. You've got your lowest priorities at the bottom. So broadly speaking, the bottom is a linear economy and the top is a circular economy. If we think about, I'm buying a computer, my old computer's a bit tired and I'm going to get a new one, or maybe I just like the latest one. The top of the waste hierarchy would question that decision and say, well, can you refuse that purchase? Do you actually need it? I do a lot of hill walking. The lightest kit I take with me is the kit I leave behind. And the purchase that has the lowest carbon footprint is the purchase that you don't make. And it goes against our consumerist society and all the marketing that goes into asking us to buy the latest things, but refuse. Reuse. Say, I've got a computer, I'm finished with it, I don't need it. Can someone else use that computer as a computer? If they can, pass it to them, sell it on eBay, whatever it is, to other brands are available. Make sure that it's reused. If it's broken, repair it. So there's a bit more work there because you've got obviously quite a high skill set to repair a computer. My mother-in-law doesn't think so, but there is. and that's repair. Recycle. You ask the average member of the public what the best thing they can do with the product at the end of its when they're finished with it, and they would say recycle. That's not true. Everything above this is better, but recycle is better than other things, so that's why we bring it in here. You break the computer down into its plastic, its metal, etc., and you would recycle it. Recovery is all about deciding you can't recycle it, and the best thing to do is incinerate it, so at least you get some energy from it. That really isn't great, but it is better than the last thing here, which is landfill, which means just bury it in the ground, which is the worst thing you can do, and is clearly the essence of a linear economy, because it's all ending up in the ground. So the waste hierarchy is this model for green recovery, because several things I would draw about that. One, it's something we should be better communicating to the public. Recycling isn't the best thing they can do. Secondly, it's for policymakers. Policymakers tend to, Scottish Government and UK and EU historically have focused on that bottom end of the waste hierarchy. How can we get out of landfill, for example? And typically that can then drive, in Scotland it has driven incineration capacity. People do the next easiest thing, which is the next step up, where really what we want it to do is be driving behaviours at the top of the waste hierarchy. There's a lot of recycling targets, for example, in local authorities and Scottish Government level, but no reuse targets. So it's an example that the majority of activity is happening down in what we would call waste management, and we would like to see that moving up the waste hierarchy into resource management. And so a green recovery, we would like to see creating jobs in reuse, in repair, and yes, in recycling, but majority we would like to see the focus in reuse and repair. And then also economic policy makers. I've included these stats on the right-hand side about how many jobs are created if you're dealing with 10,000 tons of waste with different levels of activity. So it doesn't take a hugely skilled or complicated job to deal with 10,000 tons of waste by incinerating it or putting it into landfill. Hence, that's reflected in the low number of jobs, 1 and 6, respectively. If you're recycling, however, there's more jobs. And if you're reuse and repair, a lot more jobs. Now, that's a threat maybe if you're thinking purely from a profit motive, but it's fantastic if you're thinking about a green recovery job creation model. Because we need jobs to come from this recovery, and a lot of jobs can be created within reuse repair. Just think back to that laptop image again. It doesn't take much to throw it in an incinerator or throw it into landfill, but how much does it take to refurbish, to repair a broken laptop? The skills of those jobs and the satisfaction of those jobs in terms of driving forward a reuse and repair agenda. It's good for planet and it's good for people. Looking ahead, moving to green. Green for the traffic lights and green for green recovery. Just 4 lessons I think we can learn from the COVID-19 crisis and tailor in our response to the climate emergency crisis. And 4 lessons I think we really need to learn if we're going to meet the targets set out and the real threat that faces our planet. So firstly, true sustainability. At CRNS, we talk about 4 Ps. We talk about care for people, care for planet, taking care of place, and taking care of the pounds. That's really just social, environmental, and economic triple bottom line reporting with we've split people and pounds. But that is true sustainability. You can't have a sustainable future if it totally ignores the economy, because it's not going to keep going, is it? It's not going to be self-sustaining. Think about, you run an organization that's got fantastic objectives, but they can't pay the bills. They'll go bankrupt, and that's the same as a country. You can't achieve true environmental change unless people buy into it, because it's the sum total of all of our behaviors that result in the carbon footprint that we have as a country. So I need to change my behaviors, you need to change your behaviors. You're both the problem and the solution. I'm the problem and the solution together. And so sustainability needs to take into account people, and they need to be balanced. And I do like the title of Green Recovery, because I think it's got those both aspects suggested within it. Second lesson, changing behaviors. I don't think anyone knew the level of society behaviour change that was possible by the government until COVID-19 happened. We've been talking about a climate emergency for several years, and there was, you know, obviously debate and pressure being put on policymakers to act with more pace and emergency. The obvious thing to say now is, well, we've seen what can be done. We've seen Boris Johnson stood by 2 scientific experts, shutting down whole realms of activity and starting up new ones, and Nicola Sturgeon here. And we've seen a willingness on the part of the public to change behaviours, some because they've been told to, and some because they did it anyway. So I'm thinking about working from home, I'm thinking about not flying, I'm thinking about what we're all engaged in right now, which is attending a virtual conference instead of a face-to-face one. These changes, some of them are really beneficial to the environment. And the question is, I've just included this 2x2 matrix, which is not mine, it's the Edinburgh Climate Commission. But, you know, some of the behaviours that have happened because of COVID, we want to lock those changes in. Take bike usage or lack of flying, for example. Others we want to lock out. And there are other there are things that haven't been touched by COVID-19, doesn't seem like much. Essential activities like, you know, obviously the NHS has been operating throughout this. That hasn't stopped. They've been working harder than ever. And there is question about the other things that need to be transformed or we need to encourage more of. And, you know, just obviously on the one axis, you've got the climate impact. On the other, you've got whether they've been deemed essential or non-essential for COVID-19. I just think that's an interesting model of thinking about behaviour change and what we want to achieve. Thirdly, we need to listen to the experts. We've done that in this mostly in this public health crisis. Some would say not enough. I won't get into that. But it is reassuring to see politicians flanked by scientific experts and mostly listening to what they say and putting some of that into practice. Wouldn't that be good in relation to climate change? We actually have known for years that COVID-19 was a threat. It's been on national risk registers all that time. But we didn't know when it was going to happen. Or if it was going to happen, that a pandemic would happen. Think about that in relation to climate change. We actually kind of know when it's going to happen. We kind of know the speed that it's going to happen. There's quite a lot of consensus among the scientists. So we've really got no excuse but to listen to them and take the action because it's not an unknown. It's actually quite a predictable phenomenon. And we need our policymakers to listen to the experts. And lastly, and this is picking up on the point that was made earlier, but act with boldness and pace. If my house was on fire, to take Greta Thunberg's analogy, I would either get out or I would put the fire out. I wouldn't redecorate. I wouldn't move the furniture around. If this is a climate emergency, and it is a climate emergency, we require bold and decisive action, more ambition. So, for example, one initiative I'd love to see from the Scottish Government is their circular economy bill. When it does come back, we need reuse, a viable set aside for reuse option at every household waste recycling centre in Scotland. We need reuse targets that are monitored and tracked and reported. We need to prioritise reuse above recycling. So let me just conclude. There's a deep desire to get back to normal. And obviously, the question is, what kind of normal is that going to be? Is it going to be a normal that is better, a new normal, a better normal? Is it going to be a greener, a more just normal than the one we had before? We don't just want to recover. We want to recover well. We need a green recovery and one that prioritises the urgent climate emergency that we face. So I would encourage you to engage with the consultation and other initiatives that can help make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. I've already got lots of thoughts, I know, going through my mind, and I can see questions starting to come in. So please do start posting them. And just while you're posting any questions you might have, I was just going to ask Duncan just very quickly to talk a little bit about Social Enterprise Scotland in terms of their response and what you're looking for, perhaps in terms of ideas, or if there's anything else or different ways people can feed in, Duncan, to the consultation.
Yeah, I mean, just firstly to say a big thank you to CRNS and SCDI and also Scottish Environment Link. We've worked very closely with 3 organisations over the past couple of weeks in terms of the Green Recovery consultation, and hopefully we'll work together in future as well. Just in terms of a few themes that have come out, I mean, this is kind of repeating in some ways what other people have said, because we are saying some similar things in some ways. So, for example, a green investment strategy for Scotland, creating skilled jobs in renewables and green technology and the circular economy, including very much the building of new supply chains for social enterprises. That's definitely a key part of our consultation response. And really just working in partnership with third private sector and public sector together. I think that's really important. And obviously within this, there is a crucial role for the Scottish National Investment Bank as well. A green jobs initiative, a jobs transfer fund to help unemployed workers transfer skills to new green jobs. Again, we've talked about this already in terms of jobs and apprenticeships, and particularly in terms of young people as well, and keeping social enterprises and young people at the centre of that, learning from schemes like Community Jobs Scotland and the Edinburgh Guarantee. There's always a role for procurement within these kind of conversations, so we need a new focus in terms of procurement on local social enterprises at the core of the green recovery, etc. So I'm firing through this very rapidly here. And really public money to prioritise green and ethical social enterprises, and community wealth building as well. I think community wealth building, that agenda is really, really important, and that's kind of emerging from the North Ayrshire pilot project. Social housing, organisations like the SFHA can say more about social housing, but investment in housing is kind of a win-win for many people, and that needs to be a key part of the green recovery. And there are lots of social enterprises working in things like community food and those kind of areas as well, and community food banks, and who've really led the kind of response in terms of the COVID-19 crisis. So it's just really kind of recognising those kind of organisations and their role going forward in terms of green recovery. There's lots of stuff there, so I fired through that really rapidly there, but I would say firstly, if you have any views in terms of our response, please do get in touch with me so you can find our details. I posted them in the chat earlier on, but if you want to email me or call me about anything you want to put in our response, that'd be great, particularly from a social enterprise perspective, of course. So yeah, that's me. So that's a very, very rapid fire round there, but yeah, please do get in touch in terms of our consultation response. Thanks.
Thank you, Duncan. In fairness to Duncan there, he was asked to be quite rapid, so we knew we got some time for questions. So thank you very much, Duncan. We wanted to make sure there was time there. I wanted to cut, this is perhaps I don't know if it's too tricky a question. Obviously, we already saw consultations previously around economic recovery. And it's almost, do you think that the green recovery, I mean, it's come second in the timeline. Do you think, if you're being honest, it's also second in the priorities kind of list? And I think I asked that question particularly thinking around that we look at consumption and, are we trying to drive jobs so we can drive consumption? And are we really looking at it in that rounded way? What I've heard from presenters today has been about jobs that really support and help the environment. But I wonder whether, from an economic perspective, the job thing is actually all about consumption, ultimately. And that's probably a tricky question. I'll ask Michael maybe to come in on that first.
Thanks for that, Naomi.
Oh, pleasure.
I think that's a danger. I will hold judgment on what I think of other people's motives. I'm not going to comment on that. It's above my pay grade, and I'll judge people after the event, not before. But I think there is a danger that there's a danger of a disingenuity. I think that's the word, disingenuous. Yes. When we talk about green recovery, when everyone can agree we want more solar panels and electric cars. Although I would slightly challenge that we want more electric cars if we're simply throwing away perfectly good petrol cars. We've got to think about electric is better than petrol, but throwing away things before the end of their life is not. So, if someone could retrofit petrol cars, I'd be in favour of that. So I do think that there is a lot of agreement, move to green energy, move to green transport, move to active travel, that, no one's going to disagree with any of those things. But once you talk about consumption and reducing consumption, then you're gonna divide, and you're largely actually going to divide left-right, okay? Because on the left, it's like big government intervention, and on the right, no, grow businesses, small government. So you potentially get into a state that is actually politicized when actually the climate emergency is too big an issue to politicize. It should be beyond left and right. And if we could get to a point like we have mostly with the public health crisis we're going through, that it isn't a political football, and if we can actually agree on actions that are difficult because they're the right thing to do. I mean, I take the lockdown, for example, and not make it political. We need to have similar level of behaviour change in relation to climate. And we need to not make it a political football between left and right, so we just ricochet backwards and forwards. So that, in terms of what people's motives are, I don't know, but we got to get beyond the, I guess like with COVID, there was an argument, a simplistic argument that we were at risk of going into at one point back in April or something, where it was choosing between public health and the economy. And then there became an argument that was a bit more mature than that, a sort of second stage argument. There's actually the best thing for the economy is really to nail this virus and then reopen and reopen safely, because if we remain in, half out of lockdown forever, like they're doing in America, that can't be good for the economy. So we need to do that with climate. We need to get beyond a simplistic environment or jobs. That's just, life's not that simple. And we actually think, yeah, we need jobs and we need the environment and we need good green jobs and we need an environment agenda that actually creates jobs, and how can we balance that? But I do think you do need to look at consumption, and buying stuff we don't need to impress friends we don't know with money we don't have is not a sustainable future, and we do need to cut consumption.
Thank you, Michael. So, David, am I being too cynical?
I suppose I would just agree with Michael that we have to see the two things as intrinsically linked, and for us, identifying big national programmes of investment that are going to create those good quality new green jobs is a way for government to signal that it is serious about not seeing them as trade-offs, seeing them as part of the same thing. I would say that the way that governments choose to kind of come out of lockdown will kind of indicate whether they are interested in sustainable investment-led recovery or a consumption-led recovery. I think some countries have focused too early on trying to open the kind of retail, tourism, leisure industries perhaps before it's safe to do so. And as Michael says, that will only undermine a recovery in the long term if we do that too soon. So one of the biggest kind of economic investments the government can make right now is getting test and protect, is getting contact tracing to actually work properly to suppress the virus. So I think there are clear limits to a consumption-led recovery for prospects of that anyway. Consumer confidence has been really low. I know one of the other questions in the Q&A was about Brexit. That's kind of affected people's willingness to spend for the last several years anyway. And so the idea that we can kind of quickly reopen and in a couple of weeks or months we can restore consumer confidence to previous levels is, I think, for the birds. So yeah, I suppose things we think as Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, I'm thinking back to when we did our policy sessions at the end of June, and I think we had a couple of speakers, one coming from the environmental perspective, really talking about how we need to focus on hope and ambition. And that's a word that came up in the presentations rather than perhaps always coming with the cynical kind of perspective. It's actually focused on what's the change we can make. So I think it's still important to remember that. And I was also thinking back to one of our other speakers talking about how things are much more about system change and not looking at things in silos. And it was interesting because one of the other questions I wrote down was almost in looking at a green economy approach, is it almost so broad that we don't focus on all the detail in it? Green can mean transport, it can mean waste, it can mean energy, it can mean land. There's so much space. It can mean so much that actually is green recovery almost so broad that we don't end up getting to the detail in terms of actions. Any thoughts?
Often a kind of challenge for government is how do you turn really broad concepts into kind of key deliverables. And I think particularly for small countries, it's important to try and pick 2 or 3 big things that we're going to really do well. We have limited sort of capacity, but we have key strengths in key areas. So stuff like the circular economy stuff that Michael talks about, it seems to me that compared to a lot of countries, we have certainly a degree of intellectual kind of capacity and knowledge there, compared to other countries, but we could do a lot better, but we are ahead of the game compared to some countries. So I suppose it's an issue of prioritisation for a lot of this.
Yeah, yes, I'm looking actually at some of the questions as well now coming through. We have already agreed with our panellists that are going to stay on for an extra 10 minutes. So we've got time to ask a few of the questions, and I'm keen to bring Duncan in, having not done that yet. And I guess one of the questions is looking at kind of how does social impact businesses really play a role? And I guess the question I was going to come out with was, obviously, for those who are already focused on environmental initiatives, and I guess then we kind of look at things like the CRNS members will have that as one of their key purposes. But how do we encourage a much broader sector to get involved with environmental change? And I'll perhaps start that with Duncan, if I may.
Yeah, I mean, I think in just in terms of social enterprise in general, I think a large number of social enterprises have a real keen environmental awareness anyway. I think it's part of their kind of mentality, their way of thinking, that they might have a core social purpose, which might be disabilities, it might be social housing, but they have a real keen role in, an awareness of environmental responsibilities as well. I think a lot of them demonstrate that really well for a start. I mean, you're right. I mean, it's trying to get these big issues like the climate emergency, like the COVID-19 crisis, etc., and trying to like hone this down into some practical, deliverable policies, and that's the key here. So what we're saying from our perspective is really, this is from a social enterprise perspective specifically, so we can kind of narrow those things down a bit more, which is good. But yeah, you're right. It's trying to like identify what the priorities should be. I would say just in terms of a green recovery, I mean, you can't have a recovery without a green recovery. I think it's as simple as that. So coming back to that question about, is it one or the other? It's both kind of thing. It's integrated. We have to have a green recovery. It's as simple as that. And that does tackle the kind of twin emergencies, as Michael said, around the climate emergency plus the post-lockdown economy. So yeah, I think in terms of our response, we have kind of focused down on those few issues, which I very, very quickly mentioned there, which is about procurement, inevitably, things like that. It's about the circular economy and investing in social enterprises that work in that kind of area, community food, etc. So we have honed down into a few key issues, but yeah, it's up to us and up to government to decide then what the real key drivers are, what the priorities are in an emergency situation, which we are still currently in.
Perhaps picking up again on that, taken out from the social enterprise perspective, someone's just asking about how do we create potentially more partnerships between business and the social enterprise sector around things like around procurement clauses. And I just wondered, David, if there's something you could come in on, what would you say about how we could build stronger partnerships between the different sectors, really, to try and make change happen?
Yeah, so I suppose SCDI as an organisation is kind of that sort of spirit in action, and what we try to live every day. And certainly the working with Social Enterprise Scotland and others is something that I think we need to do much more of, to bring together some of the other membership organisations to help kind of work up our own programmes of work, but I think also present something of a kind of united front and common purpose to government. I think that always really helps with persuading ministers to take action when we can do that and cross that supposed divide, which, to be honest, I think is often kind of excuse me, more kind of rhetorical than real. Certainly, our members from the private sector, they tend to join organisations like SCDI because they recognise the importance of that kind of collaboration, and it's issues that with procurement, even larger organisations come to us with issues with procurement for SMEs and social enterprises all the time. So I suppose that's where we have to start off with, as organisations ourselves, living that and collaborating.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we're always keen, I know, to try and help build some of those partnerships. And I think it's true of lots of our agencies. I think if we want change to happen, we need to do it with others and not just on our own to really try and make significant change happen. I just wanted to come back in terms of a few people mentioned kind of COP26, and it's interesting. Obviously, I think people were disappointed when that got put off, but actually a few other comments I've heard is, well, actually, were we really ready for COP26? And given it's now a further year away, what is it that actually we could really demonstrate here in Scotland? I think you talked about putting kind of Scotland on the map in terms of being competitive and showing what we could do. So I guess the question I was going to ask to all of you is where would you like to showcase what Scotland can do around green recovery in a year's time? What would be the ambition? What would be the thing you'd really love to have seen happen in terms of change?
Shall I go first on that? I don't know what Naomi said there, but because she muted at the end. But I think COP26 is an opportunity, and we need to seize it. And the fact that it's been put back a year is also an opportunity, so we need to seize it really well. I think there's been some differences between Scotland and England and the rest of the UK in the COVID crisis. Maybe a sense that we prioritise people over business, maybe. And there are some differences between Scotland and the UK in terms of climate emergency response as well. And COP26 is a bit of a football between the UK and Scotland because it's happening in Scotland, but it's largely UK government that are organising it. So that's interesting. And I think I would like Scotland to be seen as a model for green recovery. And I would like to see, obviously, my own area of reuse prioritised in that. But touching on some of the earlier comments, which I wasn't talking on at the time, but we need to close the rhetoric gap, the gap between the words that we say, there's a climate emergency and we're going to hit that, it's a top priority, we're going to hit it by 2045, we're going to hit these targets, and the action that we're actually taking. And we need to take actions now that are bold and ambitious to result in change so that we actually achieve that by then. I think that's true for politicians, and it's easy to make the cheap point that there's a rhetoric gap with politicians, but it's true in individual lifestyles as well. I care about the planet, but do my actions actually reflect that? So, I'm looking in the mirror as well as looking out the window when I make that comment. And I think if anything good can come out of COVID, could it be that we work in collaboration? Could it be that we're kinder to each other? Could it be that we are buying local instead? We're shortening food chains and supply chains, as has been commented in that. Could it be that I'm thinking about the impact of my decision on others? Just like I might think about going to a restaurant, I might infect someone. I'm thinking about what I buy and how that's what the pattern, what the footprint of that is. And could it be that we are actually up for taking real action in relation to behaviour change, not just playing around at the edges, and make some changes, because we thought we needed all this stuff, and we actually decided we actually got quite a lot of joy from sat in the garden listening to birdsong. So maybe there's an appetite to change, and can we therefore make that change for good? And if that could be starting to happen and be demonstratable, and we may actually have an American president at COP26 with it going back a year, whereas otherwise I don't think the current one would have come. So that might be another good thing that comes out of the delay.
Thank you, Michael. David and Duncan. I'll go David or Duncan, you're unmuted. You go next and then I'll bring David in.
I mean, yes, in terms of that showcasing, I think we need to showcase practical examples of where we're delivering a green economy, because there's so many great case studies of social enterprises working in recycling, working in community food, all these kind of areas. They do exist and they work really well. Obviously, they've got massive challenges, particularly at the current time, but there's so many great case studies. And I'm actually sitting here, I was just thinking just now, I'm sitting here with a Fairphone, which I feel like I work for these guys sometimes because I talk about them so much, but this is a social enterprise company based in the Netherlands, made a smartphone, which they take into account the environmental impact and where they get the materials from, and you can take it apart and replace parts which are broken. It's like a jigsaw puzzle kind of thing. And it's a great example, I think. I mean, that's quite an advanced example, but in Scotland, we have huge examples like that of just these, the green economy is happening already. It's just like, it's how do we harness that? How do we develop that? How do we franchise that kind of out a bit more and develop that and grow it and become mainstream, really?
Thank you, Duncan. David?
Yeah, just to say, I suppose it's important to recognise that COP is two things at once. It's the multilateral international negotiations, and then it's the kind of showcase PR opportunity. So there's a big opportunity for Scotland to, as Duncan says, showcase the great stuff that we're doing already, but also attract inward investment from across the world as a sustainable place to do business. If we can show that, in terms of electricity generation, we're producing renewable energy to power our industries, where we're producing more circular industries. It's a great place to live. We're looking after our natural environment. Companies internationally will look at Scotland, will look at us hosting COP and say, well, if I want to reduce the footprint, the carbon footprint of my company, then Scotland's a place that I need to invest and locate in to create jobs. And that can only help our green recovery. I suppose to Michael's point, it's really critical that the Scottish and the UK governments cooperate on this and work together, and they both have a platform at COP, and that it's not reduced to a kind of political football or bun fight between the two governments. In terms of showcasing, I would just say that in terms of the actual location of COP, it's really important that Glasgow thinks about how the city will appear to an international audience. So if COP was to take place tomorrow in Glasgow, the world would descend on a city with a giant kind of fossil fuel motorway right through the middle of it, into a venue that isn't a net zero venue. So there are just things to think about in terms of, we could really use Glasgow as an example of how to, in quick order, start to transform a city to make it greener. Because if not, then there's potentially a bit of damage to our reputation there.
Thank you. I think it's really important. I know we've run a number of these sessions, and I think it's always like, how do we make sure that we turn what in essence could be seen as talking shops into real action? And I think that's always the challenge in our sector. And I think sometimes it feels slow. I mean, we've talked about procurement, and I certainly know in our sector, we know that's been on the radar for many, many years. And yet, do we really see action in the way that we really think SMEs and social enterprises need it, despite the fact that legislation's there? And I guess we need to make sure that with climate change, that we really focus on action and not just always the talking. And Michael's got his hand up, so we've got a couple of last minutes. So just in case there's any last points, I'll go to Michael, and then just into just any final comments from other presenters.
Just 20 seconds. But the point I would make is, if you're leading a social enterprise that's not an environmental social enterprise, you can no more afford to ignore the climate emergency than you could say 3 months ago, COVID-19 doesn't affect us, we're not a health-based social enterprise. Climate emergency affects all of us. It affects, if you live on this planet, it affects you, and therefore we need to do something about it together. So you may not be an environmental charity, but you can't ignore climate emergency. And we're all part of the problem, or we're part of the solution. So let's make sure we're the right side of that sort of that equation. So, we need to be building that into every activity.
There's a strong call for action. Duncan, David, any final comments?
Nothing more from me. Just thank you very much for the discussion. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you for joining us today. Duncan, any final thoughts?
Yeah, just to reiterate again, if anybody does have any thoughts, experiences in terms of practical suggestions for a green recovery, that'd be great to feed into our consultation response. And yeah, just to say again, it's great working in partnership with other organisations, and I think this is a template for moving forward.
Thank you all, and thank you to our attendees for joining us today. We can see there's already lots of comment in the chat, and I'll take a look at that before I shut down the session as well. So if there's comments that are useful to feed into the consultation, we've got those, or points to pick up on that I know a few people have put in about projects they're running themselves, and so we'll save all of that chat and have a look. So thank you all for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.